The Blackwood Manor gates, wrought iron beasts crowned with rusted griffins, groaned a protest as the estate manager swung them open. My tires crunched on the gravel drive, a sound swallowed by the oppressive silence of the sprawling grounds. Above, the sky hung like a bruised canvas, threatening rain. This place, rumored to be a repository of forgotten histories and overlooked tragedies, now hosted another. The call had been terse, delivered by a frantic desk sergeant, Dr. Alistair Finch, celebrated historian, dead at Blackwood. Accidental fall from a second-story balcony. Case closed, almost, before it began. But they'd called me. And when they called me, it was never truly accidental. I parked my field vehicle beside a cluster of official sedans, their flashing lights muted by the encroaching twilight. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, a faint tang of decay that always clung to scenes like this. I ran a hand over my close-cropped hair, feeling the grit of the long drive. My bag, heavy with the tools of my trade, thumped against my leg as I walked towards the manor's imposing façade. The stone walls, lichen-stained and ancient, seemed to absorb the light, casting long, distorted shadows. A figure detached itself from the gloom near the manor's entrance. It was the lead detective, a man whose face was etched with the weariness of 1,000 late nights. He offered a curt nod, his gaze flicking to my bag. "Seth. Thanks for coming. Thought you'd be interested in this one." His voice was flat, betraying little emotion. "Alistair Finch. Shame. Great mind. Accident, you said?" I kept my tone neutral, a practiced habit. "Looks like it." Went out on the balcony for some air, probably lost his footing. "Old place, uneven railing, you know the drill." He gestured vaguely towards the upper stories. "Body's still down there. We've secured the scene. Just need your confirmation." The last word hung in the air, a thinly veiled request for me to rubber stamp their preliminary findings. I didn't respond, simply moving past him towards the cordoned-off area. My eyes scanned the manicured lawn, the carefully trimmed hedges, and the distant, gnarled oaks. The manor itself was a testament to centuries of quiet grandeur, its windows like vacant eyes peering out from beneath heavy brows of ivy. A forensic photographer was packing up, his camera clicking shut with a finality that echoed the scene. The scene supervisor, a young officer I recognized from a previous case, offered a brief, respectful nod. I knelt, my knees protesting slightly after the drive. The scent of blood was stronger here, a coppery tang mingling with the earthy smell of the soil. Dr. Finch's face was turned away, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, one arm flung out as if in a desperate, final reach. My first impression was always the same, a detached assessment, a mental inventory of the scene. The height of the fall, the impact point, the surrounding debris. The balcony railing directly above was indeed old, its stone balusters weathered, some chipped. But it didn't look unstable. I pulled on my gloves, a second skin, and began my meticulous examination. My eyes tracked the trajectory a body might take from that height, estimating the force, the angle of impact. Finch's body lay further from the wall than I would have expected from a simple tumble over the railing. It suggested a horizontal component to the fall, a push, or perhaps a struggle that propelled him outward. I ran my gloved fingers over the fabric of his jacket. The tear wasn't a clean rip from snagging on a jagged edge. It was a ragged, almost claw-like tear, inconsistent with the smooth, worn stone of the balustrade. More importantly, embedded within the fibers of the tweed, barely visible to the naked eye, was a fine, shimmering dust. Not stone dust from the railing. Not garden soil. This dust had a peculiar, almost metallic luster. I carefully collected a sample with a microspatula, placing it into a sterile vial. Then I moved to his hands. Finch's fingers were splayed, the nails broken and ragged. Underneath one nail, I found a tiny, almost imperceptible sliver of material. It didn't look like wood. It didn't look like stone from the manor. It looked like something ancient, something that had been handled for centuries, worn smooth by time and countless touches. I paused, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't the texture of a struggle against a modern assailant, nor the residue of a fall onto the garden path. This was something else entirely. An anachronism. I leaned closer, my gaze sweeping the ground around Finch's head. A faint, circular impression, no larger than a coin, was pressed into the damp earth, partially obscured by a fallen leaf. It was too regular to be natural, too deliberate to be random. And within its tiny circumference, the same peculiar, shimmering dust I'd found on Finch's jacket was concentrated. Just standard procedure, right? I rose slowly, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, not for a simple accident, but for something far more complex. The weight of Dr. Finch's reputation as a historian, the manor's deep historical ties, and now these minute, anachronistic details. My gut tightened. This wasn't a slip and fall. This was orchestrated. Not standard, I murmured, my voice low, sensing the shift in my tone. What are you talking about? I held up the vial, its contents a barely visible shimmer. This. And neither, I suspect, does the story of an accidental fall. The wind picked up, rustling through the leaves, carrying with it the scent of impending rain. Alistair Finch hadn't just fallen. He had been murdered, and the key to understanding why lay buried not just in the present, but in a past far more distant and dangerous than anyone suspected. The accidental death of a prominent historian was merely the opening act. And I, Seth, had just stepped onto the stage. Rain threatened, mirroring the grim certainty that had settled in my gut. Dr. Alistair Finch hadn't simply fallen. The question wasn't if he was murdered, but how, and by whom. I knelt beside the crude canvas draped over the remains, the ground uneven and slick beneath my boots. The crime scene officer, a young man with nervous eyes, stood a respectful distance, notebook poised. Ready, Seth, he asked, his voice low. As I'll ever be, I murmured, pulling on fresh gloves. This wasn't a sterile lab, it was a precipice, a stage set by violence. The air itself felt heavy with unanswered questions. I peeled back the canvas, revealing what the fall had done. Finch's body lay contorted, a grotesque sculpture of broken angles against the moss-covered rock. His tweed jacket, usually so neat, was torn, one sleeve nearly ripped away. My eyes swept over the scene, mapping every detail. The point of impact on the ground, the trajectory of the fall from the jagged cliff edge above. It looked textbook. A slip, a tumble, a tragic end. But I'd learned long ago that the most obvious answers were often the most deceptive. I started with the remains, a slow, methodical process that ignored the chill seeping into my bones. Each bone, each joint, each visible injury was a piece of a puzzle. I worked with my specialized tools, a magnifying visor strapped over my eyes, a small probe, and a collection of brushes. The initial assessment by the local examiner had noted multiple blunt force traumas consistent with a fall from height. On the surface, it held. But I dug deeper, past the superficial damage. Focusing on the larger bones, I meticulously cleaned away debris, searching for anomalies. My fingers traced the delicate ridges of his ribs, the shaft of his femur. Then, on the distal end of the right tibia, a faint, almost imperceptible spider web of lines caught my attention. I leaned in, adjusting the visor's magnification. Not a single, clean break from the impact, but a series of minute, radiating fractures, almost like a starburst pattern, originating from a point just below the knee. And another, a hairline crack on the lateral condyle of the left femur. These weren't consistent with the primary, crushing force of a long fall. These were isolated, localized impacts, before the body had begun its descent, or at a very early stage of it. A different kind of force, applied with precision, not the haphazard trauma of a tumble. My jaw tightened. Someone had struck him, likely with a narrow, heavy object, disabling him before he went over. He was hit, I said, the words barely audible, more to myself than to the officer. The officer shifted, his pen scratching. You're sure? Microscopic fractures, I explained, gesturing vaguely without looking up. Not from the fall itself. Point of impact on the tibia, another on the femur. Small, concentrated. Consistent with a blow from a narrow, dense object. Perhaps a pipe, or a heavy stick. I moved my attention to the clothing. The tweed jacket was a mess, but certain areas remained relatively intact. I carefully brushed away loose soil, then used fine tweezers to collect fibers and minute particles into sterile evidence bags. It was painstaking work, made harder by the encroaching twilight. On the inside of the left lapel, near a tear, I noticed something unusual. A faint dusting of fine particulate matter, clinging to the fibers like pollen. It was a pale, almost iridescent gray, catching the fading light with a subtle sheen. I'd seen a lot of soil, a lot of dust, but this was different. I scraped a tiny sample onto a slide and placed it under my portable field microscope. The granules resolved into crystalline structures, irregular and sharp-edged, reflecting light with an otherworldly shimmer. This was no ordinary dust. It wasn't granite from the cliff face, nor the limestone and clay from the estate's paths. It wasn't even the pulverized sandstone that made up the manor's foundations. This was a unique mineral, unlike anything native to the estate or its immediate surroundings. My mind raced, cycling through every geological survey, every obscure quarry, every known local deposit. Nothing matched. This dust was a foreign element, an anachronism at the scene, just like the fractures. It meant Finch had been somewhere else, or had come into contact with something from somewhere else, just before his death. The tension in my shoulders tightened into a knot. This wasn't a tragic accident. This was an ambush, a calculated act. The blows, the fall, the strange dust. I bagged the dust sample with extreme care. This iridescent powder was a breadcrumb, a trail leading away from the obvious. I thought of Finch's recent research, his obsession with the estate's hidden histories, the forgotten corners of its vast, sprawling property. There was a specific, derelict section, barely mentioned in the estate's public records, that had always intrigued him. A memory sparked, of a dusty, hand-drawn map I'd seen on Finch's desk during a previous visit, marking a particular structure on the far edge of the estate grounds, long since abandoned. The map had been crude, but the name scrawled beside the building was distinct: Psychiatric Hospital Abandoned Wing with Old Records. It was a place known for its unusual, almost alien, geological formations in its immediate vicinity, a unique mineral vein that had been deemed too unstable for extraction. The shimmering dust on Finch's lapel suddenly had a potential home. My next stop was clear. I needed to understand what Finch had found there, and why it had cost him his life. The encroaching twilight had given way to a crisp dawn, painting the estate's ancient stone in muted gold. My fingers ached from hours of meticulous work, but the samples I'd bagged felt like small victories against the overwhelming silence of the scene. I packed my kit, the faint metallic tang of the soil clinging to my gloves, and headed back to my mobile lab, a converted cargo van equipped with high-end microscopes and chemical analysis tools. Inside, the hum of the air filtration system was a welcome drone after the stillness of the field. I set up the trace evidence under the stereo microscope. Focusing on the minute, ochre-colored dust particles I'd carefully extracted from the tweed jacket's lining. They were distinct, almost crystalline, embedded deep within the fabric's weave, suggesting a prolonged exposure rather than a simple surface contact. Under polarized light, their birefringence shimmered with an unusual intensity. I ran a quick elemental analysis. The spectrometer's readout confirmed my suspicion. The dust contained a rare combination of iron oxides, silicates, and trace amounts of a specific heavy metal, typically found only in geologically unique formations. This wasn't just dirt, it was a signature. I cross-referenced the unique elemental fingerprint against geological databases, narrowing down the possibilities. The search results were sparse, pointing to a handful of remote, often inaccessible sites globally. Finch had mentioned once, almost in passing, during a lecture on ancient mining techniques. He'd dismissed it as geologically interesting but archaeologically barren. My gut told me otherwise. The journey to the Carpathians was long, a blur of winding roads and increasing isolation. The GPS signal grew sporadic as I veered off the main highways, following coordinates I'd painstakingly cross-referenced from obscure academic papers I found referencing the geological anomaly. The landscape grew wilder, the forests denser, until I finally reached a rough, unmarked track. My vehicle bounced over exposed roots and loose stones, the suspension groaning in protest. Eventually, the track opened into a clearing. Before me lay a scene that made my breath catch. It wasn't barren. It was a recent, unsanctioned archaeological dig. Tarpaulins, frayed and stained, covered what looked like freshly exposed earthworks. Shovels and picks lay haphazardly, as if workers had dropped them and fled. Dr. Finch hadn't just mentioned this place, he had been here. And he hadn't been alone. I spent an hour documenting the site, taking samples, noting the scale of the excavation. It was extensive, far beyond what any casual enthusiast would attempt. This was organized, well-funded, and deeply clandestine. The evidence suggested a rapid abandonment, a sudden cessation of activity. Something had spooked them. Back in the nearest semblance of civilization, a small, forgotten village, I started asking questions. The villagers were wary, their faces etched with suspicion. It took a few discreet inquiries, and a shared bottle of local spirits with a grizzled innkeeper, to get a name, the research assistant, a young man named Andre, who had worked closely with Finch. He had left suddenly, the innkeeper claimed, like a ghost. My investigation led me to a dilapidated building on the outskirts of a nearby industrial town, a sprawling, forgotten structure that had once been a textile mill, now a cavernous, empty shell. It was the kind of place where secrets could be buried and forgotten, a perfect hideout. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, a fitting atmosphere for forgotten histories. He was hunched over a portable stove, warming a can of soup, his face gaunt, eyes darting nervously. "Andre?" I asked, my voice echoing in the vast space. He flinched, dropping the can. It clattered to the concrete floor, spilling its meager contents. He scrambled back, his hands raised in a defensive posture. "Who are you? What do you want?" "My name is Seth. I'm investigating Dr. Finch's death." I kept my tone even, non-threatening. "I believe you can help me understand what he was working on, out in the foothills." His eyes widened, then narrowed. "Finch is dead?" I didn't know." His voice was barely a whisper. He looked genuinely shocked, but fear still clung to him like a shroud. "He died in a fall at his estate," I explained, omitting the details. "I found something at the dig site. The same mineral dust I found on his clothing." That hit him. His shoulders slumped. He ran a trembling hand through his disheveled hair. He shouldn't have gone back there, he muttered, more to himself than to me. Gone back where? To the site? I pressed gently. What was he looking for, Andre? He hesitated, glancing around the decaying factory as if expecting to be overheard. He became obsessed. Not like before. He was always driven, but this was different. He called it the lost artifact. Said it was the key to everything. The key to what? Andre shuddered. He wouldn't say, not directly. Just that it would rewrite history. He started meeting people. Not academics. They met at night, in remote places. He was agitated after those meetings, secretive. What kind of artifact? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline. This was it. He only ever showed me sketches. Old, impossible designs. Something ancient, but out of place. He said it wasn't just about discovery. It was about preservation. Keeping it hidden, or bringing it back to light, depending on who he was talking to. Andre's voice grew hoarse, laced with a desperate urgency. He was afraid, Seth. Really afraid. He said he'd stumbled onto something. A legacy, he called it. A forgotten legacy that some people would kill to keep buried. He stopped, catching his breath, his eyes wide and fixed on mine. He told me if anything happened to him, I should forget everything. Just run. Did he tell you who these people were? Andre shook his head vigorously. No names. Just the benefactors. He said they had unlimited resources and no scruples. They wanted the artifact, but they also wanted to control the narrative around it. He'd been digging into something far deeper, far more dangerous, than I could have imagined. And the lost artifact was at the heart of it all. I looked at Andre, this terrified young man, a pawn in a game he clearly didn't understand. I knew then that I wasn't just investigating a death, I was uncovering a legacy someone was willing to kill for. And I had just stepped directly into their path. The unsettling words from Andre still echoed, a discordant note against the usual calm hum of my lab. Finch hadn't simply stumbled. He'd been excavating something profound, something that had cost him his life. And the lost artifact was the fulcrum. I pushed away from the microscope, the polished bone fragment on the slide suddenly feeling heavier than its actual weight. My resolve hardened. The estate grounds, usually pristine, felt subtly disheveled under the overcast sky. I found the designated area, a cordoned-off section near the estate's crumbling western wall, marked by a flimsy yellow tape that seemed more a suggestion than a barrier. The official investigation, it seemed, was already winding down. Beneath a makeshift tarp, the earth was disturbed. not just by the initial accident, but by something more recent. Freshly turned soil mounded around the edge of a shallow trench, darker and looser than the surrounding compacted ground. A small, modern trowel, its handle still bearing faint smudges of mud, lay discarded beside a rock. Finch's tools, I remembered from the preliminary reports, had been meticulously catalogued and removed. This one wasn't among them. Someone had been here, and recently. I knelt, running a gloved hand over the disturbed earth. The soil was loose, friable, indicating it hadn't settled long. Not from rain, the last rainfall was days ago. This was recent, clandestine work. My eyes scanned the area, sifting through the layers of debris and discarded materials. The color was a deep, earthy red, almost black in places, with a faint, geometric pattern etched into its surface. It was unlike any local earthenware I'd ever encountered. The texture was coarse, unrefined, yet the intricate design spoke of a sophisticated, ancient culture. This wasn't local. This wasn't even European. My fingers trembled slightly as I carefully brushed away the clinging soil. And it had no business being here, not with the type of artifacts typically found on this estate. This was anachronistic, a glaring discrepancy that screamed of illicit activity. Still digging, Seth? I straightened, turning to face the lead detective, his expression a mixture of fatigue and irritation. He stood with his arms crossed, his gaze sweeping over the scene with an air of finality. Just confirming my initial findings, Detective, I replied, carefully placing the pottery fragment into an evidence bag. And I've found a few anomalies. He sighed, running a hand over his close-cropped hair. The official report is nearly finalized. Accidental fall. Open and shut. Finch wasn't just working, someone else was, too. It's ancient, and it doesn't belong. The detective merely grunted, his eyes skirting away from the bag. Look, I appreciate your thoroughness, Seth, but sometimes a fall is just a fall. We've got nothing to indicate otherwise. No struggle, no defensive wounds on the body. Just a man who lost his footing. Or was made to lose it, I countered, my jaw tight. The resistance was palpable, a wall rising between me and the truth. They weren't just pressured to close the case, they were actively avoiding looking deeper. I'll be taking this fragment for analysis. And I'll need to re-examine Finch's notes, particularly anything related to his specific excavation area. He exhaled slowly. Fine. But don't expect to find anything that changes the outcome. The pottery fragment, now secured in a specialized container, sat on the passenger seat, a silent testament to Finch's dangerous discovery. The official narrative was a lie, and the local authorities were either complicit or willfully blind. I pulled into the secluded parking lot behind my forensic lab, the building a block of concrete and steel against the twilight sky. As I approached the service entrance, a flicker of something caught my eye. The heavy steel door, usually sealed with two separate locks, was ajar. Just a fraction of an inch, but enough. This wasn't right. I drew my small utility knife from my pocket, the familiar way to small comfort, and pushed the door open slowly, my senses on high alert. Nothing immediately seemed out of place. No shattered glass, no forced entry. This wasn't a smash and grab. The cabinets, where I stored my most sensitive samples, were all closed. But as I reached my desk, I noticed it. My meticulously organized stack of research papers, Finch's preliminary reports among them, had been subtly shifted. A specific folder, containing my detailed notes on the peculiar bone anomalies, was slightly askew, not quite aligned with the others. On the workbench, a small, heavy bone caliper had been moved, its position altered by mere millimeters. Nothing was missing. Nothing was overtly damaged. This wasn't a robbery. This was a message. Someone had been here, in my sanctum, sifting through my work. They knew what I was looking at. They knew I was closing in. The implications settled over me like a shroud. The game had just escalated, and I was no longer just an investigator. I was a target. I secured the door, the click of the locks sounding ominously loud in the quiet lab, and stared at the pottery fragment, its ancient mystery now intertwined with a very modern threat. The detective's dismissal of the shard, his certainty that the case was closed, grated against every instinct I possessed. He saw a tragic accident, I saw a meticulously staged scene, and now, a single, anomalous piece of evidence that refused to fit the narrative. My lab was a sanctuary of precision, a quiet space where chaos yielded to order under the microscope. I wasted no time. The pottery fragment, no larger than my thumbnail, lay cradled in a velvet-lined box. First, I examined the surface, zooming in past the cracks and grime. The texture was expertly rendered, mimicking the rough, earthy feel of ancient earthenware. Under higher magnification, I noted the subtle variations in mineral composition, consistent with specific clay deposits known from the ancient civilization Finch had been studying. The glaze, too, appeared authentic, a thin, vitreous layer showing the characteristic crazing of age. My initial assessment on sight hadn't been wrong, this felt genuinely old. But then I ran the elemental analysis. While the bulk material matched the target civilization, there were trace elements, minute quantities of modern synthetic polymers, almost imperceptible, embedded within the matrix of the clay. And the pigments used for the subtle decorative patterns? A blend of historically accurate ochres and a microscopic, almost invisible binder that hadn't existed until the late 20th century. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a replica, it was an incredibly sophisticated forgery. Not merely a crude imitation, but a masterwork designed to fool even seasoned experts. It was a ghost, crafted with such precision that it could pass for genuine under all but the most rigorous scrutiny. Whoever made this understood the nuances of ancient craftsmanship, the geological specificities of the region, and the very limits of modern forensic science. The implications hit me with the force of a physical blow. Finch wasn't merely a historian researching ancient artifacts. He was likely uncovering a high-stakes forgery ring, a clandestine operation dealing in pieces so perfectly rendered they could rewrite history or, more accurately, profit immensely from their deception. The tragic fall suddenly took on a far more sinister hue. The detective's words echoed in my mind, "This case is done." He was wrong. It had just begun. I packed my field kit again, the weight of the new evidence pressing on me. The estate felt different as I drove back through the gates, the stately architecture now seeming to hold its breath, concealing secrets within its ancient walls. The study, untouched since my last visit, was still permeated by the faint scent of old paper and pipe tobacco. I moved methodically, my gaze now sharpened by the revelation of the forgery. I ran my hands over the spines of books, tapped along the wooden panels of the desk, and checked behind every painting. Finch was meticulous. If he had discovered something this dangerous, he would have hidden his findings somewhere equally clever. My fingers brushed against the underside of the ornate mantelpiece above the fireplace. It was carved from dark oak, heavy and solid. Most of it was smooth, but near the right-hand corner, I felt a slight, almost imperceptible give. I pressed harder, searching for a seam, a catch. Nothing. I tried again, applying pressure in a different spot, then another. Finally, a faint click resonated from within the wood. A section of the mantelpiece, a small, decorative panel depicting a stylized vine, pivoted inward with a faint groan, revealing a shallow, narrow cavity. My pulse quickened. Inside, nestled amongst a few flakes of dust, were two items: a slim, military-grade flash drive, its casing dull and scratched, and a folded piece of aged parchment. I carefully extracted them. I could see the faint glow of an indicator light on its end, meaning it was still powered, but I knew without trying that its contents would be locked behind layers of encryption. Finch wouldn't leave something like this unprotected. The parchment, however, was what truly held my attention. There were faint, almost invisible lines connecting certain points, forming an intricate, indecipherable pattern. At the bottom, a single, faded annotation in Finch's elegant script read, "The Forgotten Legacy." Records. The old wing. My mind raced. The old wing. It was too specific, too deliberate. Finch was pointing me somewhere. And then I saw it, not directly on the map, but a faint, almost erased symbol near one of the cryptic clusters. It was an archaic symbol for a medical caduceus, but distorted, almost corrupted. My knowledge of local history, especially concerning the estate's sprawling historical connections, clicked into place. There was only one institution nearby that would fit such a description, an institution with a vast, forgotten past. The image of a sprawling, derelict structure, its windows like vacant eyes, materialized in my mind. Finch was leading me to the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. The air in the study felt heavy, charged with the ghost of his final, desperate warning. I had to follow the trail. The air in the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records was a stagnant, heavy blanket, thick with the scent of decaying paper and forgotten lives. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that speared through grimy, broken window panes, illuminating the skeletal remains of filing cabinets and overturned desks. Finch's cryptic symbol, the distorted caduceus, had pointed me here with an unnerving precision. It wasn't a place one visited casually. The building groaned around me, a symphony of settling wood and whistling drafts, each sound a reminder of its long abandonment. I moved deeper into the cavernous space, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, painting fleeting patterns across shelves crammed with yellowed files and binders. This wasn't just an old building, it was a mausoleum of information, a repository of narratives perhaps deemed inconvenient or dangerous in their time. My laptop came out of its rugged case, followed by the external drives and specialized decryption hardware. The hum of the cooling fan was a small, reassuring sound in the vast silence. My fingers flew across the keyboard, connecting the recovered drive from Finch's study to my system. The encrypted files, a jumble of alphanumeric characters, stared back at me. Finch had been a meticulous man, a historian who understood the value of information and the necessity of its protection. I started with the map, projecting it onto my secondary screen. The clusters Finch had marked, previously indecipherable, now seemed to pulse with a hidden logic, especially with the corrupted caduceus as my new anchor point. I started running algorithms, cross-referencing the unique symbol with historical cartographic ciphers, ancient guild marks, even obscure heraldry. Hours blurred. My eyes burned, tracing lines of code, watching patterns shift and resolve. The initial attempts were fruitless, a frustrating dance with dead ends. The weight of the investigation, the quiet threat that had followed me from the estate, pressed down. I thought of the subtle, anachronistic details I'd found on the victim's remains, the deliberate misdirection. Finch wasn't just murdered, he was silenced. Then, a flicker. A partial match. Not to a known symbol, but to a method of encoding, one I'd only encountered in highly specialized academic circles dealing with suppressed historical documents. It involved layering multiple symbolic systems, a forensic palimpsest. My breath hitched. This wasn't amateur hour. This was professional, deliberate obfuscation. I refined the decryption parameters, feeding the caduceus symbol as a primary key. Slowly, agonizingly, the map began to yield its secrets. The cryptic clusters weren't just locations, they were nodes in a network. Place names started to appear, not just towns or cities, but specific, historically significant estates, private collections, even obscure museums that rarely opened their doors to the public. My mind raced. These weren't random points, they were interconnected, forming a web that stretched across continents, linked by obscure dates and Latin phrases that hinted at patronage and acquisition. Next, the encrypted files. These were far more robust, demanding a more aggressive approach. My decryption software hammered at the layers of protection, cycling through brute force attacks and dictionary searches tailored to historical and anthropological jargon. The processor's word, hot air spilling from the vents. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a breakthrough. A cascade of green text scrolled down the screen, followed by the first fragments of readable prose. My eyes scanned, devouring the words. They spoke of the legacy, not as a collection of artifacts, but as a living entity, a body of knowledge and influence. They detailed the keepers, not as simple curators, but as guardians, their mandate extending far beyond mere preservation. One file, titled Memorandumorum, spoke of recontextualization of inconvenient truths and the shaping of accepted narratives. Another, on the integrity of provenance, detailed how genuine artifacts could be strategically lost or re-emerge to support manufactured histories, effectively rewriting the past to suit a present agenda. It wasn't about forgery alone, it was about control, about wielding history as a weapon. My gut twisted. Finch hadn't stumbled upon a simple artifact smuggling ring. The air in the abandoned wing suddenly felt heavier, charged with the weight of these revelations. I wasn't just a forensic anthropologist anymore. I was a reluctant archaeologist of hidden truths, digging through the debris of suppressed knowledge. The quiet creak of a floorboard from deeper within the building made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I wasn't alone. My breath plumed faintly in the chill. I'd spent the last 3 hours hunched over a stack of Dr. Finch's early research notes, pulled from a box labeled Early Career, Unpublished. The smell of mildew and old ambition clung to the brittle pages. My fingers, smudged with fine grit, traced an underlined passage. It was an obscure reference to a society of guardians mentioned in a footnote about a controversial excavation in the 1970s. Finch had dismissed it as a fringe theory, but the note immediately after, scrawled in his distinct hand, read, "Consult Professor Thorne, knows the old guard." Professor Elias Thorne. The name clicked. A retired curator, a formidable figure in the academic world, and Finch's early mentor. If anyone could shed light on Finch's more esoteric interests, or the shadowy guardians, it would be Thorne. He was known for his encyclopedic knowledge and his equally legendary reclusiveness after a public falling out with the university decades ago. I pushed away from the rusted metal desk, the chair scraping a protest across the concrete floor. It felt like I was pulling a thread from a tightly woven tapestry, and with each tug, more of the pattern began to emerge. The determination in my gut hardened. Leaving the desolate structure, the afternoon sun felt like a sudden, harsh spotlight. The city outside was a jarring contrast to the quiet decay I'd just left. Thorne's last known address, according to the university's outdated alumni records, was a brownstone on the city's quieter, tree-lined west side. The brownstone was imposing, its brick façade weathered but meticulously maintained. Ivy climbed one side, and a heavy oak door stood sentinel. I pressed the brass bell plate. After a long moment, the door creaked open, revealing a sliver of a face, framed by a shock of unruly white hair. Elias Thorne. His eyes, sharp and intelligent despite their age, narrowed at me. "Professor Thorne?" I began, my voice steady. "My name is Seth. I'm a forensic anthropologist. I need to speak with you about Doctor. It wasn't a question." "Yes, Professor. And I believe it wasn't an accident. I've found some. Have you ever encountered anything like it in your archaeological work?" Thorne's eyes flickered to the bag, then back to my face, his expression now guarded. He hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades, he opened the door wider. "Come in, Seth. But understand, I don't have much to say about Finch. Not anymore." The interior was a labyrinth of bookshelves, stacked high with ancient texts and archaeological journals. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and pipe tobacco. He led me to a small study, dominated by a large mahogany desk cluttered with maps and artifacts. "Speak your piece," Thorne commanded, settling into a worn leather armchair, his gaze fixed on me. I laid out my findings concisely, detailing the unusual wear patterns on Finch's clothing, the precise nature of the head trauma inconsistent with a simple fall, and then, the mineral dust. "It's a unique composition, Professor. A silicate with traces of elements rarely found together, suggesting a very specific, geologically unusual source. And it was present in Finch's study, on his clothes, and even embedded in the rock face where he supposedly fell." Thorne picked up a magnifying glass from his desk, examining the tiny dust sample in the bag. His fingers, gnarled with age, trembled slightly. A long silence stretched between us, punctuated only by the ticking of an antique clock. "The Guardians," he finally murmured, almost to himself. Finch was always too curious for his own good. My breath hitched. "The Society of Guardians?" I found a reference in Finch's early notes. "What are they, Professor?" Thorne leaned back, a bitter smile playing on his lips. "They call themselves the Keepers now. A clandestine society. Old money, old names, tracing their lineage back through centuries. They believe they are the true custodians of history, not the academics, not the public. They seek to control archaeological finds, especially those that challenge established narratives or hold significant political or financial value. They manipulate excavations, suppress discoveries, even lose artifacts they deem too dangerous or disruptive." Dangerous? They rewrite history by controlling its physical remnants. He paused, his eyes narrowing once more at the dust sample. "This dust. It reminds me of something. A specific locale." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Where?" "A private estate," Thorne revealed, his voice laced with a reluctant certainty. "The Blackwood estate, far up in the northern mountains. It's been in the same family for generations, rumored to have an unparalleled private collection, mostly uncatalogued. The family who owns it. They were whispered to be among the founding members of the Keepers. and the estate itself sits on a unique geological formation. An ancient quarry, rich in a particular vein of iridescent mineral, almost identical to what you describe. Finch was obsessed with a particular legend tied to that estate, a pre-Roman settlement supposedly buried beneath it. The Blackwood estate. Remote. Private. And now, a direct link to the mineral dust and the keepers. Finch hadn't just stumbled upon a conspiracy, he'd been murdered for getting too close to its heart. And I knew I couldn't afford to make a single mistake. The cold knot in my stomach had hardened into a lead weight. My destination was the Blackwood estate, Thorne's sprawling, remote fortress, but I knew a direct approach would be suicide. Thorne was too careful, too insulated. I needed an edge. My research, a frantic deep dive into Finch's scattered notes and a few local rumors I'd managed to unearth, pointed to a tangential, almost forgotten location nearby, a decrepit structure known only as the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. Locals whispered about it, a place left to rot after a scandal decades ago. Finch had a single, cryptic entry about it, old plans, forgotten history. It was a long shot, but Thorne's modern security wouldn't account for ancient paper trails. It stood sentinel on a desolate rise, a mile or so from the estate's main gates, a crumbling monument of stained concrete and broken windows. A rusted chain-link fence, long since breached by nature and neglect, offered no real barrier. I moved with a practiced fluidity honed by years of navigating forgotten spaces, my gear bag slung low, my senses alert. A gaping hole in a side wall, where a service entrance once stood, provided my ingress. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of my boots on shattered plaster and fallen ceiling tiles. Stripped wires dangled like forgotten vines, and overturned furniture lay scattered, ghosts of past occupation. The place smelled of mildew, old paper, and something metallic, like forgotten blood. I navigated the labyrinthine corridors, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, past rows of empty, rusted beds and peeling paint. My target was the records room, if one still existed. I found it in the furthest section, behind a heavy, warped wooden door that groaned open like a dying beast. Here, the destruction was less complete. Shelves, bowed under the weight of decades, held stacks of decaying files, their contents spilling onto the floor. I pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves, a professional habit, and began to sift. Hours bled into one another. I sorted through patient logs, administrative memos, and maintenance reports, my eyes scanning for anything out of place, any name or detail connected to Thorne or the estate. Then, buried under a pile of antiquated discharge papers, I found it, a set of brittle, yellowed architectural blueprints. Not of the abandoned wing, but of the Blackwood estate itself, dating back to its original construction. One particular tunnel, marked Service Access East Wing, seemed to bypass the main security grid. A direct path, if it still existed. Finch's words echoed, old plans, forgotten history. With the blueprints carefully folded and secured, I retreated from the abandoned wing, leaving no trace of my presence. The intel from the records was invaluable. It changed everything. My heart hammered, a steady drumbeat of resolve. I approached the Blackwood estate from the east, navigating dense thickets and overgrown service roads, relying on the ancient blueprint as my guide. The modern security was formidable: laser grids, pressure plates, motion sensors, and a silent drone occasionally sweeping the perimeter. But I knew where to look. The old service access, now just a barely visible fissure in the stone wall, was exactly where the blueprint indicated. It took patience and a precise application of my tools, but the ancient mechanism groaned open, revealing a narrow, dust-choked tunnel. The air inside was stale and heavy, carrying a faint, metallic tang. I moved quickly, the adrenaline a sharp current through my veins. The tunnel eventually opened into a larger, more modern space, a service corridor humming with the low thrum of unseen machinery. I moved with the stealth of a predator, my senses extended. The corridor led me into a cavernous area that hummed with a different kind of energy. This was no ordinary storage. The smell hit me first, a complex blend of resins, solvents, and aged paper. My light swept across workbenches laden with specialized tools, magnifying lamps, and a bewildering array of materials. Pigments in antique hues, fragments of ancient pottery, rolls of papyrus, and even partially carved stone fragments lay scattered. This was a state-of-the-art forgery workshop. On one bench, a half-finished cuneiform tablet, meticulously etched, sat under a heat lamp, awaiting its final patina of age. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. But the workshop wasn't my ultimate goal. The blueprints mentioned a hidden chamber, accessible only through a specific sequence of actions within the original structure. Remembering a subtle detail from the old plans, I pressed a specific knot in the grain, then another, a silent click echoing in the vast space. My light beam pierced the gloom of a hidden vault. It wasn't large, but its contents were breathtaking. Displayed on velvet-lined shelves, protected by temperature and humidity controls, was a trove of genuine, priceless artifacts. A golden funerary mask, its eyes staring blankly into eternity. Intricately carved jade figures. Scrolls of unparalleled antiquity. These weren't forgeries, they were the real thing, clearly looted from legitimate archaeological sites. The very history I dedicated my life to preserving, here, locked away by a man who profited from its destruction and replication. Then, the world around me changed. A high-pitched, insistent whirring began, growing louder, closer. Security. My presence had been detected. The whirring intensified, accompanied by the clatter of metal on stone. Thorn's Advanced Systems. I slammed the vault door shut, the ancient mechanism protesting, and sprinted back towards the service corridor. Red lights flashed, painting the walls in an urgent, pulsing glow. The whirring was directly overhead now, followed by the metallic rasp of an approaching drone. I could hear distant shouts, the thud of heavy boots. They were closing in. Behind me, I heard the metallic screech of the drone trying to navigate the constricted space, its rotors whining in frustration. I didn't stop, didn't look back, my lungs burning, the taste of dust and fear thick in my mouth. I burst out into the cool night air, gasping, the sounds of the estate's security systems fading behind me as I disappeared into the thick undergrowth. The blueprints and the image of the stolen treasures burned into my mind. I had what I needed, but the cost of getting it had just been made terrifyingly clear. The chill of the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records had deepened, seeping into my bones despite the focused heat of my concentration. The moonless night pressed against the grimy windows, a vast, indifferent canvas to the urgent, meticulous work unfolding within. I spread the blueprints across a warped, dusty table, weighing them down with my field kit and a heavy, leather-bound ledger I'd found earlier. The faint scent of decay and old paper clung to everything, a constant reminder of the forgotten secrets this place held. My hands, though steady, moved with an almost frenetic energy. I arrayed the photographic evidence I'd painstakingly captured at the estate, wide shots of the accident scene, extreme close-ups of the fractured stone, the barely perceptible scuff marks on the ancient banister, the disturbed dust patterns. My notes, scribbled in the margins of my field journal, provided the running commentary, the timeline, the questions. The intel from the records, combined with these blueprints, was the key. The estate wasn't just old, it was a labyrinth of hidden passages and concealed chambers, a physical manifestation of the conspiracy itself. The blueprints detailed a network of tunnels beneath the main structure, leading to an underground bunker, a location I'd only heard whispered about in connection to the keepers and their illicit trade. The diagram showed a specific, concealed entrance, not far from where Finch had fallen. Not a fall at all, I now knew. A staged plunge. I pulled up the high-resolution images of the balustrade. There, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a series of small, shallow indentations. They weren't natural wear. I cross-referenced them with the blueprints, with the structural diagrams. They matched. They matched the exact leverage points needed to weaken the ancient stone just enough, to make it appear as if it had simply given way. And the tool marks. I zoomed in further. A unique striation pattern, almost a signature. My mind raced back to Thorne's study, to the collection of antique tools I'd briefly glimpsed, a set of specialized chisels, each with a distinct profile. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, just another eccentricity of a collector. Now, the image of a particular chisel, its tip slightly blunted on one edge, flared in my memory. The striations on the balustrade, the blunted edge of that tool. It was a match. Not definitive, not yet, but a powerful, damning correlation. Then there was the soil. The microscopic analysis showed a peculiar mix, ancient garden loam, yes, but also a fine, almost crystalline sand, rich in specific mineral deposits not native to the estate's immediate grounds. I remembered the small, ornate display case in Thorne's private study, filled with samples of soil and rock from various archaeological sites. He was a collector of more than just artifacts, he collected the very earth that housed them. The sand in Finch's boots, the sand in one of Thorne's labeled vials, a site known for its unique mineral composition, a site that, according to the records I'd found, was a primary source for some of the most valuable keeper artifacts. Finch hadn't just fallen, he had been led, or dragged, through a specific area. Thorne, the esteemed historian, was not merely a passive recipient of these artifacts. He was an active participant, perhaps even a leader, in the Keeper's conspiracy. The fall was a meticulously orchestrated cover-up, designed to look like a tragic accident, leveraging the estate's crumbling antiquity. My gaze drifted to the blueprints again, specifically to the detailed section of the underground bunker. Its purpose wasn't just storage, it was a secure processing and exchange point. And the records, those faded, brittle ledgers, detailed specific dates, specific transactions, specific names. Names that, even veiled in code, were beginning to make a terrifying kind of sense. The air in the abandoned wing felt suddenly heavy, pressing in on me. I had everything I needed to build an unassailable forensic case. The physical evidence, the photographic documentation, the historical records, the architectural secrets. It was all here. But the weight of that truth settled heavily in my gut. My life, I knew, was now gravely at risk. These weren't petty criminals, they were powerful figures, deeply entrenched, with connections that reached far beyond the estate gates. The police force, the very authority I was about to approach, was potentially compromised, a pawn in a game I was only just beginning to understand. I began to meticulously organize my findings, creating a layered presentation. Each piece of evidence meticulously documented, cross-referenced, bulletproof. The narrative had to be clear, concise, and utterly irrefutable. There would be no room for doubt, no space for dismissal. The tension was a living thing in my chest, a coiled spring waiting to release. I spread the blue acetate sheets across the grimy, scarred surface of a forgotten filing cabinet, the plastic shimmering faintly under the beam of my task lamp. The acetate held my latest findings, spectral images of the residue I'd scraped from the ancient mortar in the manor's hidden passage, digitally overlaid with Thorne's personal excavation permits from a decade ago. The chemical signatures were a near-perfect match, a unique blend of silicates and ancient binding agents, virtually unheard of in modern construction. This wasn't just old, it was deliberately old, precisely placed to conceal something vital. My finger traced the faint outline of a symbol on one of the permits, a stylized serpent devouring its tail, almost invisible unless you knew to look. It was the same symbol I'd found etched into the base of the stolen artifact, a detail only visible under specific light frequencies. The Keepers. Their mark. He won't deny this, I muttered, my voice thin in the echoing silence of the wing. The air smelled of dust, mildew, and stale paper, a testament to decades of neglect. I'd spent countless hours here, meticulously piecing together the fragments, turning over every stone, every microscopic fiber. My phone, a stark anachronism on the dilapidated desk, buzzed. It was the detective. He's agreed to meet, the voice crackled, barely audible over the static. At the estate, tomorrow morning. Says he wants to clear the air before the public inquiry. A thin smile touched my lips. Thorne was walking right into it, arrogant and overconfident. He thought he could charm his way out, manipulate the narrative. He didn't know the kind of air I was about to clear. Good, I replied, my voice steady. Tell him I'll be bringing my full report. And a colleague. I wasn't going in alone. The next morning, a pale, anemic sun struggled to pierce the persistent autumn haze as the assigned driver navigated the winding gravel path to Thorne's estate. The manor loomed, a grand, imposing silhouette against the gray sky, its ancient stones holding secrets I was determined to unearth. I clutched my briefcase, its contents a damning indictment, my heart a dull, rhythmic drum against my ribs. This wasn't just about Doctor. He was impeccably dressed, a picture of old-world charm, his smile practiced and smooth. Dr. Seth, he said, extending a hand I reluctantly shook. His grip was firm, almost challenging. And your associate, I presume, he nodded to the colleague who accompanied me, a quiet, observant man from the Historical Preservation Department. Mr. Thorne, I began, wasting no time on pleasantries. I've completed my full forensic analysis regarding Dr. Finch's death and the anomalies at the site. I placed the briefcase on the polished mahogany table, clicking it open with a deliberate snap. The sound echoed in the room. Defiance? Crossed his eyes. Anomalies? I assure you, the estate has been thoroughly inspected. A tragic accident, nothing more. That's where you're mistaken, I countered, pulling out the first set of magnified photographs. The microfractures on Dr. Finch's metacarpals are consistent with a struggle, not a fall. And the residue under his fingernails? Not dust from the ancient stones, but a specific type of ancient mortar, one found only in the hidden passage you recently excavated. I laid out the spectral images, the permit copies, the chemical analysis reports. Each document a nail in his carefully constructed coffin. The passage itself was concealed with a mortar blend matching your own excavation permits from a decade ago, Mr. Thorne. A blend so unique, it's practically a fingerprint. I pushed the blue acetate sheets across the table, the serpent symbol starkly visible. And this symbol, Mr. Thorne? The Ouroboros. The mark of the keepers. The same mark on the artifacts you've been illicitly trading. Thorne's composure finally cracked. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing to slits. Preposterous. Fabrication. You have no proof of any keepers or any illicit trade. I have the proof of a dead man, I stated, my voice hardening. Finch uncovered your operation. He found the hidden passage, he found the artifacts, and he found the evidence linking you to the keepers and their network. You're a fool, Seth, he snarled, pushing back from the table, his chair scraping loudly. You think you can waltz in here and accuse me without consequence? He moved towards a tall, ornate cabinet, his hand reaching for something within. The authorities have been informed. Your connections, your network, it's all coming to light. This isn't just about Dr. Finch anymore. It's about every artifact you've stolen, every piece of history you've erased or distorted. Thorne spun around, a heavy, antique letter opener now glinting in his hand, its blade wickedly sharp. His cultured facade had vanished, replaced by a raw, desperate fury. "You won't expose anything," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You're trespassing. And you've seen too much." He lunged, not at me directly, but at the table, sweeping his arm across it. My meticulously arranged evidence scattered, reports fluttering to the floor, spectral images sliding across the polished wood. The letter opener came down with a vicious slice, tearing through one of the acetate sheets, narrowly missing my hand as I instinctively pulled back. My colleague shouted, stepping forward, but Thorne was too quick. He moved like a man possessed, eyes wild, the letter opener a dangerous extension of his rage. The grand study, once a symbol of his power, had become a cage, the air thick with tension, the scent of burning wood and old paper mingling with the metallic tang of imminent danger. This was it. The culmination of weeks of relentless pursuit, ending not in a courtroom, but in a desperate, deadly dance within the very heart of his domain. Nailed the point home with a sickening thwack into the polished surface. My meticulously arranged evidence scattered, reports fluttering to the floor, spectral images sliding across the polished wood, now marred by a deep gouge. The archivist, his face a mask of furious desperation, lunged again, not at me, but sweeping his arm across the table, trying to obliterate the remaining proof. I reacted on instinct, a surge of adrenaline overriding the shock. I grabbed his wrist, twisting hard. He was older, but fueled by a fanatical energy, surprisingly strong. The letter opener clattered, skittering across the floor. Our struggle was brief, brutal. My shoulder slammed against the heavy oak table, a jolt of pain radiating through me. I heard a shout, then the heavy thud of boots on the concrete floor. Two security officers burst into the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records, their faces grim. They moved with practiced efficiency, pulling the archivist away from me, pinning him against a dusty filing cabinet. He fought, a guttural cry escaping him, eyes wide with a manic terror, fixed not on me, but on the scattered remnants of my work. "You don't understand," he shrieked, his voice raw. "You don't know what you're doing." I stood panting, my chest tight, watching them cuff him. The lead detective entered, his gaze sweeping over the chaos, landing on the archivist, then on me. "Seth," he said, his voice low, "are you all right?" I nodded, rubbing my shoulder. "I'm fine." He didn't get far. "Most of it's still here." I gestured to the floor, where some of the acetate sheets and reports lay crumpled, but largely intact. The torn sheet, the one detailing the specific microfractures on the victim's tibia, was a casualty, but the crucial data remained. The next few hours blurred into a whirlwind of statements, evidence collection, and hushed conversations with the prosecuting attorney. The abandoned wing, once a quiet sanctuary for forgotten documents, now buzzed with official activity. Every crumpled sheet, every displaced artifact, was meticulously catalogued. The archivist's frantic attempt to destroy the evidence, captured by the surveillance cameras I'd insisted upon, only solidified his guilt and, more importantly, confirmed the existence of the keepers and their desperate, violent measures. The full weight of the conspiracy began to unravel with astonishing speed. The archivist, under intense questioning, confessed to his role in manipulating the scene, to fabricating the accident, and to his unwavering loyalty to Thorne and the keepers. He spoke of a legacy, a hidden history they believed was theirs to control, a truth too dangerous for the public. His confession, coupled with the forensic evidence I'd painstakingly compiled, the anachronistic tool marks, the specific soil particulates, the unique trace elements on the victim, painted an undeniable picture of murder and a vast network of illicit trade. News channels, hungry for a scandal involving a prominent historian and a historically significant estate, devoured the story. Thorne's carefully constructed empire crumbled under the relentless glare of public scrutiny. The stolen artifacts, some of them priceless, were recovered from various hidden caches, a climate-controlled vault beneath an old boathouse, a false wall and a supposedly derelict library, even within the estate's own museum, disguised as replicas. Each discovery was a victory, a piece of history reclaimed. The keepers, once a shadowy cabal whispered about only in academic circles, were publicly exposed. The sheer audacity of their operation, spanning decades, was staggering. I watched the press conferences, saw Thorne's face, once composed and authoritative, now haggard and defeated. There was no triumph in it for me, only a profound sense of exhaustion. The emotional and psychological toll of the case began to settle in the quiet moments. The image of the archivist's desperate face, the violence of his lunge, the casual way Thorne had dismissed human life, it all replayed in my mind. I had chased the truth through bone and soil, through ancient texts and modern crime scenes, and I had found it. But the truth, when finally unveiled, was rarely clean or satisfying. It left scars, not just on the victims, but on those who sought it. I found myself back at my laboratory, not working, but just standing amidst the familiar hum of equipment. The acetate sheet, patched with archival tape, lay on my desk, a stark reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything. Justice, I reflected, wasn't a single, definitive act, but a relentless, often brutal, pursuit. A colleague approached, offering a quiet commendation. "You did good, Seth. Really good." I managed a faint smile. "I just followed the evidence." He nodded. "Sometimes, that's the hardest thing to do." Later, alone, I looked out the window at the city lights. The world felt different, sharper, more dangerous. The success of this case, the exposure of the keepers, had affirmed my scientific method, but it had also shown me the depths of human depravity and the lengths people would go to protect their illusions. I was a forensic anthropologist, dedicated to the silent stories of the past. But this case had pushed me beyond the quiet sanctity of the lab, into the volatile heart of human conflict. Perhaps, I mused, my future lay not just in uncovering the truth, but in actively fighting for its preservation, even if it meant stepping into a new, more perilous role in the world of forensic investigation. The bones had spoken, and I had listened. Now, I had to decide what to do with their truth.